Welcome, and thank you for being here. Brooklyn Queens Now is a chapter of the National Organization for Women. Please visit our website, brooklynqueensnow.org. That's brooklynqueensnow.org for more information about our history and what's coming up. We meet monthly and work to realize our core issues. What brings us here today is the issue of ending violence against women, girls, and the LGBTQ communities. Since this spring, we have committed ourselves to better understand who gets trafficked, who benefits, how to recognize it, and ultimately how to help the survivors and punish those who traffic. Today's webinar further explores and deepens our understanding of trafficking. With the help of our panelists, we will look at the programs and laws that currently exist to bring trafficked individuals from the status of victim to that of survivor. Our panelists are well-versed in the federal, state, and local laws that address trafficking. They have developed training programs that work. They are client-centered, which means that the aspects of the trafficking issue are addressed from the point of view of the person who is currently or in danger of becoming trafficked. We know you will have questions, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. I now introduce you to Victoria Pelotti, Chair of the BQ Now Anti-Trafficking Committee.
Welcome, everyone. This is the second of 3 webinars about the problem of human trafficking presented by Brooklyn Queens Now. Our first webinar was designed to educate our members and the public about the problem of human trafficking here at home. While the speakers were from Queens, the problem exists throughout New York City. Today's webinar will expand our understanding with a deeper dive into the crime of human trafficking. Through our panelists, we will not only highlight trafficking in Brooklyn, but we will take you through the process of how a trafficked person goes from being a victim to being a survivor. Our third webinar, scheduled for January 11th, 2022, will have a more national and global perspective and will lead us to take action on the issue. Your questions are important. To ask a question, click the Q&A symbol at the bottom of your screen. Type your question and press enter. The panelists will address as many questions as possible at the end of their presentations. The webinar is being recorded. It will be edited and the recording and PowerPoint slides will be made available on the BQ Now website, brooklynqueensnow.org. Without further delay, I pass the mic to BQ Now President Julie Kirshner.
Thank you, Victoria. Our first panelist is Assistant District Attorney for Kings County, David Weiss. Deputy Chief, Human Trafficking Unit, Co-Chair, Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. ATA David Weiss has been a prosecutor since 2006 and in 2014 specialized in human trafficking cases. His multi-agency investigations and prosecutions led to the takedown and closure of 2 hotels and the arrest of their owners for permitting and promoting prostitution in both Brooklyn and Queens. He has since become a special assistant U.S. District Attorney for New York's Eastern District. In that role, he brought cases against traffickers of underage girls. David regularly presents on human trafficking investigations throughout New York State and the United States. His expertise is even sought on the international level, where he works with the U.S. Department of State in the State International Visitors Program, where he speaks about prosecutions focused on evidence-based data, prosecuting without a victim, and shaping the prosecution in the true victim-centered manner. The Kings County District Attorney's Human Trafficking Unit provides training to the community on the signs and how to report the crime to the DA's Human Trafficking Hotline. The training is provided to community members as well as government agencies, healthcare providers, and other service providers. Welcome, ADA David Weiss.
Thank you very much, Julie and Victoria and everyone at Brooklyn, Queens Now for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know everybody's taking time out to be here, so I appreciate you coming along with us. I'm excited to be here and present for you and be part of the panel with my co-presenters. I know we have a lot of great information to present, so we'll go right into it. So like Julie said, my name is David Weiss. I am the Deputy Chief of the Human Trafficking Unit at the Brooklyn DA's office as well. So we prosecute and investigate all human trafficking crimes that primarily occur in Brooklyn, specifically sex trafficking and labor trafficking. As part of my duties, I'm also a co-chair along with Anita for the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. And that is a Department of Justice funded trafficking task force to bring law enforcement and service providers together to collaborate and prosecute and investigate and work on human trafficking issues collaboratively and holistically, like Julie said, all for trauma-informed, making sure that everything is done for the purposes of the victim, as well as strengthening cases and punishing the traffickers and punishing the exploiters. So just very briefly about our task force. We can go to the next slide, please. Like I said, DOJ, we are DOJ funded, and it's compromised by all the main people in New York and New York City, as well as other agencies that work around trafficking. There's law enforcement, there's non-governmental organizations, there's hospitals are on our task force, the government agencies throughout New York City, all the regulatory agencies, all other Department of Buildings and similar type of agencies, as well as all the different Department of Social Services on the local, state, as well as on the federal level as well. We have partners. And the point of everybody being together in this collaborative model, why this task force is a good model, is we're bringing everyone together. So we meet regularly, we discuss the current issues, and we're also having regular communications with all the main stakeholders from all the different agencies that are relevant for these issues. So if I need a victim referral or I need a contact at one of these agencies, I'm not picking up a phone book and trying to Google who can I call. We have all the right partners at our tips to make it easier and all for the benefit of the victim. So we're able to get services or case investigation started very expeditiously. And moving to the next slide. And just to be basic, I know this is part two and you guys have already had a part one in presentation about what trafficking is, what it isn't, but I think it's always good to get a refresher and really understand what it really is, because as a prosecutor and seeing the cases that are reported to law enforcement and the tips that come through our hotline and the national hotline and coming to the police department, there's always a lot of misconceptions what trafficking is and also what it really isn't, and also why we can't move forward in certain cases and what we need to prove to be able to sustain an investigation and an actual prosecution. And I'll say this as well, because you're going to hear from experts right after me with Anita and Lindsay. They have very different functions within the space, and what trafficking might look like to them and where might them with a victim they're working on doesn't necessarily mean, from the prosecution standpoint, it doesn't mean we can always sustain the elements to prove a case, but it doesn't mean that trafficking obviously is not occurring. But in our respective roles of what we're doing, some of these are some of the things that we need to prove. And at the basic level, it's an AMP, action, means, and purpose. The trafficker is committing some type of action, and whether it's recruiting, harboring, which is basically another way of holding, making a space available, you're moving someone from one location to another, or you're obtaining through means of force, fraud, or coercion for a purpose, whether it's commercial sexual activity, which we see very often, labor trafficking, which is the involuntary servitude, debt bondage, and other people call it slavery, where those are other types of actions where the trafficker is using one of those means to get a benefit for themselves through those means. And it's having, on a labor trafficking side, it's potentially having someone work in a restaurant and not providing the human decency requirements of a real working relationship. We see it a lot in what's been in the news in nail salons, massage parlors, pretty much any type of industry in the religious, diplomatic, where trafficking, labor trafficking is occurring, where it's, well, on the surface, what it seems to be legitimate businesses, but obviously once you peel away the layers, the owners, the managers, the exploiters, the traffickers are not acting in a legitimate manner. And from the commercial sex side, from the sex trafficking, when it involves a minor, it's a lot easier to prove because we don't need to prove the fraud or coercion, or you might hear the FFC as an acronym, because by default, based on federal law as well as state law, New York state law, if the person involved in the commercial sex act is a minor, by definition, they are a victim of sex trafficking. And if we can tie them to an exploiter, we don't have to prove that there was force involved to make a sex trafficking case, which is different than what several years ago, prior to 2018, is where they instituted that law. Prior to 2018, if we had a victim who was 14 years old, 13 years old, then in their minds, they were claiming it was a consensual arrangement with their pimp. All we could charge is promoting prostitution. The law has changed, and I'll get to that in a few slides away, but now we don't need to prove that fraud, force, or coercion. Moving to the next slide. Thank you. And I talked about the means of what fraud, force, and coercion actually means. And here's just a slide that really brings it out a little bit, what the elements really compromise the elements in definition. So force, I think, is fairly easy to understand. It's physical violence. A pimp or a manager or forces a woman to engage in commercial sex, whether it's an adult or a minor, using physical violence or sexual assault or kidnapping or physical restraint. That meets the definition of force. We start getting into a little bit more complicated and a little bit more confusing, where we start moving on to fraud, where there's no overt act of fraud, there's no violence, but there's deceit, there's promises or lies, or they're lying about working conditions or the wages or where they're going to be working or what the kind of work they're going to be doing. Where we've had cases where the pimp promises the girl that she'll be a model, she'll be in photo shoots, and when she comes to Brooklyn from wherever and has no family or friends or support network and no money or ways to get home, all of a sudden then they bring them to a strip club or they bring them to a club or on the track and force them to engage in prostitution. And that it was deceitful because now they have nowhere to go and they were brought there under fraud circumstances. Coercion is kind of the very similar level of hybrid between fraud and force, where again, there's no really overt acts of violence, but there's underlying threats. There's kind of like backhanded threats where if someone has their status is undocumented and they will threats of deportation, or, hey, I'm not forcing you, I'm not holding you down, I'm not physically violent with you, but if you leave or don't work in this restaurant or don't walk the track, I'll call immigration, I'll call the cops and get you arrested. I know your status and LGBTQ possibly, that's not disclosed yet, and we'll tell your family, we'll tell your friends, we'll kind of put out embarrassing secrets about what you're doing, and that kind of is the coercion. So these are different means of getting someone to engage in acts against their will, where these are kind of some of the things that we need to prove in order to make a successful prosecution. Moving to the next slide. And just a sex trafficking profile. In 2019, through our task force, we did a survey and compiled stats, and the average victim that we saw, age of a victim, was 24 years old. And that's obviously, it was only a short time period of when these stats were compiled, but this is taking into account, we service many clients that are adults, and then some kids that are 13, 14, 15 years old, which is why this is the average age of, in that time period, what we saw. And again, speaking about what we're seeing in Brooklyn and what's not reported on the news and in movies, the common gender of victims that we've dealt with in our office as a case are female runaways, predominantly African-American, and overwhelming majority are US citizens. And again, this is not to say that we don't see victims involving men and boys and international. And you'll hear from Anita and Lindsay that based on their work, they work with a lot of that clientele as well. But again, what is reported to the police and to our office and becomes investigations, this is the overwhelming majority of the type of cases we see. And it's also important because this goes against the myths that are reported in the news all the time, which I'll get to in a little bit, which kind of takes away from what we're really dealing with on the boots on the ground. The next slide, please. And to that end, I think it's worth repeating. I know it's in the slides in the beginning of the presentation and part one as well, but it's always good to hear this because I hear this throughout my office from people that are not as aware. And when I'm speaking, I do a lot of community outreach and people ask me these questions and they don't understand the difference between what trafficking really is and is not. And it's not transportation. Transportation or smuggling across the border, are federal crimes and has nothing to do with trafficking. Very often we will see people that are smuggled into the country in search of a better life. And there might be border and immigration violations, but generally that is not exploitation. It's possible that once they're in the country, the exploitation will follow that based on vulnerabilities that other people will speak about, but the act of crossing the border or coming from overseas, international on an airplane, is not trafficking. And more often than not, the cases that my unit and my office prosecutes are not, there is no movement involved. There's no, even from other states, it's a girl that was born in Brooklyn, lives in Brooklyn, her pimp is from Brooklyn, and it's all going on in the same neighborhood. She's a runaway, she's in the child care system, and from based on those vulnerabilities, she's getting exploited, but it's everything happening in Brooklyn and no international peace and no movement is required. The next slide, please. And some of those myths that we hear all the time is it doesn't happen in my town, it's somebody else's problem. And people walking the track, that they're adults, they're not victims, because if they were victims, they would seek help. They wouldn't keep going back out there. If the pimp's not putting a gun to their head, then therefore they have agency in what they do, and they're not victims. And over again. And the big one is the traffickers target victims. I know last year I was dealing with it a little bit, and I know my colleagues around the country in law enforcement were dealing with it also, where those tips coming in that Wayfair was trafficking people in large furniture containers because they were giving their furniture names of people and they were charging $16,000, $17,000 for a bedroom dresser. And that's code name for a child that they're selling, where you order that thing and a child is delivered to your house. And it wasn't just a tip that you just kind of brush off and say, this is nonsense. Reports were made to the FBI, Homeland Security, and it takes away valuable resources chasing down leads like that, where it clearly turns out to not be the case. And there's oftentimes you hear the same thing about the white zip ties on your windshield wipers. And women, if you're walking to your parking lot, your car in the parking lot, and you see your windshield wipers are zip tied together, just get in your car and drive away because a van is about to come behind you and kidnap you into a sex trafficking ring. And that makes the rounds on Facebook and other social media and then gets reported to law enforcement. And again, it takes away resources and very limited resources where now they're having to chase down these leads and taking away from the trafficking that's going on by their neighbor, by their family member, like from people that they know each other. So it's always important to really understand what trafficking is and isn't. And more often than not, what I see in my office, there's usually some type of relationship. Not always like familial, but boyfriend, friend, a friend of a friend, friends from one residential facility recruit their other friends to work for a pimp until they get involved with something that they're not comfortable with. So it's very rarely do we see that case where it's complete strangers just off the street. Next slide, please. And I mentioned the laws, and it's a little bit convoluted, and this is how the legislator wrote the law. But for sex trafficking, which is a B violent felony, we have to prove that the pimp or the trafficker intentionally advanced or profited from prostitution by subsection 5, which is highlighted, which is the main one we see, which is using force, like I mentioned earlier, to instill fear in the victim that if they don't comply and engage in the prostitution, the trafficker will cause physical injury or death. That is the most common sex trafficking charge that we use in Brooklyn. And that requires the trafficker to register as a sex offender upon completion of their sentence. And it's also a violent felony. But we see all the time subsection C, which is committing a felony. And while they're doing that, they force the person to engage in prostitution. But we see withholding documents, exposing information. These are all the elements, like I mentioned, where you're moving on to moving away from the force, moving on to the coercion and to the fraud, where these are different elements. Where, if you can go back one slide, please, thank you. Where some of them also is you're using abuse of power, where we've seen that sometimes in labor trafficking on the diplomatic side, where they're bringing their employees over from another country where labor trafficking might be accepted or more common. And here they're using their title and their diplomatic status as a way to continue doing what they do. We've seen withholding ID, where girls have had their ID taken and now they can't leave because they don't have their documentation. Or as part of the coercion, the pimp says, hey, you can leave. I'm not forcing you. I'm not holding you, but I've seen your ID. I know where you live. I know where your family lives. And I know the way your little cousin or sister or brother go to school every morning. So who knows if I won't be there tomorrow, but you can leave. I'm not holding you down. That's obviously a form of force, coercion, all of them together, causing that person to continue to engage in what they're doing, which also takes away from that myth of all the pictures you see of like the girl sitting in a corner in a dark room in handcuffs and chains, which is obviously not what we really see. And the next slide, please. And I mentioned I started off talking about the trafficking model. This is a collaborative model that we put together through our task force, and talking about trauma-informed and victim-centered. The victim is always the center of everything. And if you keep this model in mind, this will show you really how the pieces fit together, that I'm part of law enforcement. We're one piece of helping the victim get justice, get away from the trafficker, get whole, orders of protection, things like that, which in my world is very important. And I think we're the most important part of this puzzle of helping a victim, because you need to arrest a person or else they'll keep doing it. But to the victim, we're one cog in the multiple services that they need. They need medical services. You're going to hear from Lindsay at Savvy, where if they were raped, they have sexual assault kits, they need to go to the hospital, they need to get medication, they need to get examined, they need they need ID if they can't get food stamps to go buy food and eat, they're hungry, housing and education and case management, which is something Safe Horizon provides. There's all these different parts of the services helping a victim that every one is important, but all works together. And if a person is going through having their kids taken away and they're dealing with family court, the last thing on their mind is they want to come to the DA's office and testify and go in front of a room full of strangers. And it's very traumatic. It's very tough to really relive all this. They're thinking about, oh, I haven't eaten in a couple of days. I haven't taken my medication. My kid is going to be taken away from me. So I need to get my life in order before I could work on getting the trafficker off the streets or things like that. So I think this collaborative model wheel really puts everything together of what being victim-centered really is. And do I have more time, or is my time up?
If you could finish up, David, I'll move to the next slide.
Next slide. Right. So this was the end of my slide. So that's just a little bit of what we do in Brooklyn. I have some examples more that I can go on that if anyone does have questions at the end, but I'll stop here. And again, I appreciate it and thank you. And here's my information. If anyone does have any questions, I'm happy to take it via email. That's our hotline number that's staffed 24 hours by a detective in our office. If anyone does want to report a tip or has a tip to mention, that's another way to get in contact with us. So thank you again.
Thank you, ADA Weiss. David will return in a few minutes for Q&A. Our next panelist is Anita S. Tika, Esquire. Anita Tika is the Senior Director of the Anti-Trafficking Program at Safe Horizon. As we've learned from ADA Weiss, Safe Horizon and the Kings County DA's office work together in a client-centered program. As Senior Director, Anita oversees a dynamic, multidisciplinary team of lawyers, social workers, trainers, and administrative staff, which approaches the problem of human trafficking in a holistic way. Safe Horizon anti-trafficking clients come from more than 80 countries, are victims of sex and or labor trafficking, and comprise all genders. Anita spearheads the anti-trafficking program's policy and advocacy efforts, as well as representing this comprehensive program at federal, state, and local levels. In coalition with the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, ATTEST, Freedom Network USA, and other worker rights organizations, Anita has lobbied to support reauthorizing the Federal Trafficking Victims Prevention Act, including the current reauthorization cycle. Aside from her role as co-chair of the Kings County Anti-Trafficking Task Force, Anita also co-chairs the task force's labor subcommittee. Her experience as a litigator who worked with child labor and sex trafficking victims in the Philippines prepared Anita for her current position. As one of the largest direct service providers for human trafficking victims on the East Coast, Safe Horizon provides holistic anti-trafficking services. Please welcome Safe Horizon's Senior Director, Anita Tika.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to everyone at Brooklyn Queens Now who has helped us with preparing for this presentation and gathering this group of panelists so we can provide some more information to the community at large. So this slide really covers the resources that Safe Horizons anti-trafficking program offers to victims and survivors of human trafficking. Dave gave a very good overview of what human trafficking is according to the federal framework. He talked a bit about New York law. He talked about forced fraud and coercion. And so I think that was a really great primer to lead into the next phase of this panel. With respect to what the anti-trafficking program as a direct service provider sees on the ground in Brooklyn, actually our clients come from all 5 boroughs. We have clients who have come from Pennsylvania and Connecticut, Long Island, upstate New York, clients who are moving to New York from other parts of the country. And so we're actually quite wide-reaching, and we serve clients who are both in Brooklyn and outside of Brooklyn. And actually, the highest percentage of our clients come from Queens. And our theory on that, based on client interviews, is that clients feel more comfortable seeking an anti-trafficking provider and direct services outside of their borough. So they can travel. The travel does involve some other complications, but it's a way for them to create distance between themselves and their trafficker. So they're willing to go to another borough to access the services they may need if they feel safer doing so. The anti-trafficking program was formed in 2001, 1 year after the passage of the seminal federal legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So we have 5 different focus areas, actually. I have a team of immigration attorneys who work primarily or rather entirely with all of our foreign national victims, and they provide relief and consultations regarding T visas and U visas premised on trafficking. They help clients apply for green cards, coordinate with law enforcement to apply for continued presence. And all of these are forms of temporary legal status that allows a victim to remain in the United States during the pendency of potentially an ongoing criminal investigation. We also engage in family reunification. So we have a lot of clients who don't want to return to their home countries. And so they have made a life for themselves here, regardless of any horrific abuse they may have endured as a victim of human trafficking. And most of our clients choose to stay, and then they retain our services for family reunification. And so our attorneys will then apply for derivative visas for eligible family members in the home countries anywhere in the world. And we work closely with the International Organization for Migration to coordinate with the local consular offices so we can have the family apply for legal relief and then bring them over into the United States. This is where the social workers come in, and then they can more holistically support the entire family post-reunification. I also have a team of very experienced social workers. One of our social workers, our supervising social worker, Ileana, has been with the program since 2001. And so she's really been involved with the anti-trafficking movement in the United States from the passage of the TVPA. So we're incredibly fortunate to have her. Our social workers work with all of our clients, both our U.S. citizen clients, which we refer to as our domestic clients, and all of our foreign national clients. And as noted here, they help our clients apply for any public benefits that they might be eligible for. They help connect our clients for housing, both emergency and long-term, for employment opportunities, for educational opportunities. They also provide intensive case management. We utilize interpretation services. We do safety planning, especially if clients might still be involved with their traffickers or might still be trafficked we do work with clients who are still currently in their trafficking situation. So that is a different level of safety planning. And of course, we provide trauma-focused therapy. So we have clients who perhaps their needs might skew more towards case management. We have other clients who are now ready to work through their trauma and they're stable from a material resources perspective. And now they're ready to dive deep and to do some incredibly difficult work in terms of working through the trauma and any compounded victimizations they may have experienced earlier in their lives. In terms of the clients that we see, most of our clients are actually labor trafficked. So we see hundreds of clients a year, all human trafficked. Most of them are labor trafficked. Our clients come from over 80 countries, including the United States. And right now, all except one of our labor trafficked clients is a foreign national. We do have, I think, at least one labor trafficked client who is a US national. She was labor trafficked by her father in her youth, actually. Most of our clients overall are foreign nationals. And we do have in any given year, we have a percentage of 20 to 30% self-identified male victims. We are now seeing more self-disclosure from our male victims of sex trafficking and sexual abuse that they may have suffered during the course of their labor trafficking. We also work with unaccompanied minors that may have crossed the border and they have been picked up by Health and Human Services. They've been determined to be a victim of human trafficking or at heightened risk for trafficking. They are certified as victim and then they're funneled to my program or other programs for connection to services and to counseling, and usually immigration relief as well because they are unaccompanied minors. The third area of the program is training and outreach. We'll talk about that a little bit later, so I won't go into too much detail about that. And fourth, policy advocacy. Most of my work, aside from overseeing the program, is really diving deep into the policy and the advocacy work, the legislative reforms, the new laws that we need to pass, the existing laws that we really need to strengthen to make sure that they're as victim and survivor centered as possible. And so I've been engaging in this work for over the past 10 years, more than 10 years. I co-chair one of the national coalitions, the Alliance to End Slavery and Trafficking, and I'm on the steering committee of the Freedom Network, which is the largest domestic coalition of service providers who work with human trafficking victims in the United States. We recently in New York passed the START Act. The START Act will allow victims of human trafficking to make a motion to vacate their criminal record of any convictions related to crimes that their traffickers forced them to commit. This is an expansion of prior New York law that was really quite limited in this area. And as you can imagine, it's going to have pretty massive positive ramifications for both our foreign national and our US citizen clients. And lastly, the program really focuses heavily on survivor leadership. We have a group called Voices of Hope that's comprised of current and former ATP clients. And these are clients who have expressed a really deep desire to engage in public advocacy. So we have had clients pre-pandemic, of course, who came out with us and did trainings and they co-presented. They spoke on panels and they did conferences with us and they did different convenings. They put on events. They did events for the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force that Dave and I co-chair. And so these are a group of clients that they really want the community at large to learn about human trafficking. And they are the ambassadors because they are the ones with lived experience. And so in wrap up, and yes, next slide, please. Perfect. So these are the takeaways that we really provide to all of our clients. As Dave indicated, not all cases can be criminally charged, even if the person has experienced human trafficking. And so we tell all of our clients that you have suffered, you're the victim of a crime, you are a survivor. And again, we use the terms that our clients use to describe themselves. And that regardless of what has happened, regardless of your immigration status, you have rights. You have rights, you have access to service, you have a right to be treated with dignity and with respect, and for us to partner with you in self-empowerment. And this is how we partner with our clients moving forward. I also included a notation here for the ATP intake line. So if you want to make any referrals or anybody has any individuals who may possibly be trafficked or they're indicators of trafficking based on Dave's presentation, you can always call the intake line or the general line, which is also included here. And I also included the number for the federally funded National Human Trafficking Hotline that is operated out of Polaris. The last slide, please. Finally, here is my contact information and the contact information for Eva, who is our training and outreach manager. We'll talk a little bit more about training and outreach in a few minutes, but for any of you who would like a more directed one-on-one training for your group or your entity or organization, please feel free to reach out to either Eva or myself, and we can set that up for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Director Anita Tika. She will return for Q&A in a short time. Our final panelist this evening is Lindsay Curtis, Supervisor of Training, Outreach, and Education, Mount Sinai Savvy. Lindsay Curtis has been involved in advocating for survivors of sexual violence since 2016. She's familiar with programs not only in New York, but in Pennsylvania, and most recently at the Services Empowering Rights of Victims Center for Family Services in Cumberland, New Jersey. Her experience is derived from hotline work, advocacy work, trafficking prevention, and educational outreach. She knows what survivors of trafficking face as they reach out for help. Lindsay works as a key member of Mount Sinai's Sexual Assault and Violence Intervention Program, SAVVY. It is here where she focuses on prevention, operating as the supervisor of training, outreach, and education. Her experience has resulted in presentations at the National Sexual Assault Conference and the JBWS Conference in Cumberland County, New Jersey. Originally created to meet the needs of rape victims, the Mount Sinai Sexual Assault and Violence Intervention Program, SAVVY, is service-oriented. SAVVY works in hospital emergency rooms and provides counseling to survivors and families and friends. They educate the public and professionals about issues affecting survivors, and they work with coalitions to advocate policy and legislative changes on behalf of survivors. Please welcome SAVVY Supervisor Lindsay Curtis.
Hello, good evening, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. I think that was a really great introduction to SAVVY. So SAVVY's perspective and where we fit into this, I think fits so nicely into the other presentations. So we are a trauma-informed therapy program, and we provide emergency room advocacy. Because we are a hospital-based program, a lot of our trafficking efforts include training and education in hospital systems and in medical care. And I think that will come up a lot during my conversation with you all tonight. Our services are free and confidential. We are specialized in servicing marginalized communities, and we speak over 20 languages. We're based in Manhattan, Queens, and coming soon to Brooklyn. I myself am the educator for Mount Sinai SAVVY. If anyone wants to reach out afterward, I provide free education around intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking. You can go to the next slide. So because, as we've discussed a little bit already, traffickers may be related to that person in some way who's experiencing the harm, right? They may be family, friends, or romantic partners. So there is some overlap between talking about trafficking and domestic violence. Both are ultimately about control. Some individuals experiencing trafficking may be trafficked by an intimate partner. And that is really a really good entry point to thinking about how SAVVY addresses gender-based violence, because a lot of these things are not siloed into individual topics, right? Sexual violence, inter-partner violence, and human trafficking can sometimes all be occurring at the same time. You can do the next slide. Trafficking survivors are often viewed as criminals and not victims by processes. I think that when we look at the framework of addressing this, it's great to have partners in law enforcement and from prosecutors' offices, and also to understand that some survivors may not want to engage in criminal justice processes because they have already experienced a criminality from their trafficking experience. So what are some other needs that might be addressed through programs like SAVVY? What are other things we can support them with? Of course, if they want to engage in criminal justice processes, we're there for them. But what might some of those other needs be? You can do the next slide. And what can we do? So what is Mount Sinai's role in supporting survivors of human trafficking? Next slide, please. Our anti-trafficking program. So the Savvy anti-trafficking program is dedicated to creating a positive change in the lives of survivors. We work to empower people, right, who have been disempowered. We're committed to a non-judgmental, strengths-based approach that prioritizes client self-determination. So we are practicing letting the survivor lead, right? We are not pushing survivors to make decisions that they don't want to make. We are not pushing survivors to leave a trafficking situation or to change their lifestyle in some way, right? It says here non-judgment of clients' coping methods. We're really just supporting their agency and restoring control that has been lost in trauma. We are offering them many avenues for healing. Next slide. So our anti-commercial sexual exploitation work, we work with a lot of different community members, right? So we work with support groups. We have individual clinical support. We have outreach and education, which is where I come in. And we also have a relationship with Queens County's Human Trafficking Intervention Court, which is where we often see a lot of clients, right? People who may be engaged in criminal justice processes, who may have been identified as survivors, right? So maybe someone was charged with prostitution and they were identified as actually being trafficked. So they may be diverted and given services through Savvy. You can do the next slide. So under New York state law, right, under the public health law, it requires that hospitals and other healthcare facilities establish policies and procedures and provide training to identify, assess, and provide treatment or referrals to suspected victims of human trafficking. Mount Sinai has implemented a system-wide policy on human trafficking to meet those requirements. You can do the next slide. So here's the approach. It's about recognizing, assessing, and then treatment and referral. You can do the next slide. We have an advocacy program that works in tandem with our hospitals. So advocates go through a 40-hour training in order to understand the unique needs of sexual violence, inter-partner violence, and human trafficking survivors. So the advocate's role is to create a safe, trauma-informed, non-judgmental space. They're speaking with clients alone in a private space. This might come up a little later. We're talking about red flags. Assessing those immediate needs. Does that person have somewhere to go after they leave the emergency room? Does that person have a place to sleep? Do they need food? Do they need medical care? Validate, communicate, and empower. Review options with patient and develop a plan of care that the patient desires. And then warm referrals. What happens after a person leaves the emergency room or any kind of service that's engaged with survivors, right? Are we going to hand them a phone number or a card that says you should call this number and they'll help you? Well, we should really be making sure that there's someone on the other end of the phone, that if we need to make that phone call together, we're equipped to do so. Next slide, please. So these are some of the policies that we work to train the professionals in terms of healthcare workers, right? Always maintaining privacy, confidentiality, and empathy. Use professional interpreters. This is something really important, especially in a healthcare setting. It's often a policy in hospitals. But for example, say a patient comes in and they're with someone who wants to interpret for them. Is that really safe? Is that really confidential? What if it's a child? What if it's that person's partner, right? Making sure that there's a professional interpreter to make sure that there's good communication that's also confidential. Practicing in a trauma-informed manner. So building trust and rapport, using non-judgmental language, focusing on strength, and being aware of your own emotions and facial expressions. Sometimes it's really important just to stay neutral and to be listening, not being so reactive in an environment where you're working with a survivor. You can do the next slide. So this is what a person-centered approach looks like. We've got the whole person-centered approach, which leads to increased safety and harm reduction. You can continue the next slide. So when we recognize, assess, and then go to treatment, right? Recognizing those red flags, then assessing using the survivor-centered approach. Then we provide the treatment and referral. Connecting someone with resources, providing information, validating and empowering, and our harm reduction approach, right? It is not about shaming somebody. It is not about trying to make changes for that person on their behalf, right? We're empowering them. You can do the next slide. This kind of shows it again, right? We've got safety planning, we've got legal services, emergency financial assistance, and basic needs. Then we've got short-term care, mental and physical health care. A lot of patients may come through psychiatric emergency rooms and not just through the other emergency room. Employment and income, language assistance, legal services and immigration relief, and a sense of safety. And then we move to a long-term, right? Health and healing, career and education, legal services, and sometimes family reunification. You can go to the next slide. This kind of reiterates that safety planning, harm reduction, and appropriate referral. You can go to the next slide. So what are some of those potential red flags that we discuss when we are working with providers? Physical signs, right? Changes in physical appearance, inappropriate dress for season or time of day, unkempt appearance, a lack of proper hygiene, hungry, in need of food or water, right? Could be behavioral signs, fearful, submissive, hypervigilant, nervous. They may be deferring to someone that's accompanying to them, right? So maybe you're asking them a question and they turn to the person who's accompanying them for the answer. And they aren't really talking themselves. They're letting someone else do all the talking on their behalf. We have psychological signs, disoriented to time and place, anxious, could be heavily medicated, could be a little incoherent, suicidal ideation, could be self-injurious. And then we have medical signs, visible injuries, tattoos, markings, STIs and multiple pregnancies. I could do a whole hour on the intersection between reproductive health care and trafficking. And that is something I can talk about a little bit in the Q&A. You can continue. So my little case study that I was going to review, if we have time, was, should I pause here or should I continue? I know
You can go ahead with your case study.
Great. So this is an example of a case that we had and what we did for the survivor, for Jane Doe. Jane Doe was a 38-year-old woman from Mexico. During her childhood, she experienced sexual abuse in the home. There was a limited education. The mother couldn't really afford to send her to school. She left at an early age to seek employment. She had several children and was a single mother by age 20. She was abandoned by that father involved in there was an IPV relationship, and that person who was her child's father left. So eventually she sought out more work and more opportunity, right? This is an economic uncertainty and unstable situation. She met her trafficker in another city and he convinced her to come to the US with him. So basically he was saying, there's job opportunities, we're going to get you set up, we'll get you paperwork and so on. Once she arrived in New York City, she was forced into prostitution. Eventually, in 2006, she escaped her trafficker and was deemed by ICE to be a sex trafficking survivor. However, she didn't follow through with the processes that they put her in to get a T visa, right? She had a mistrust of law enforcement, so she went off the map and disappeared. Now, 11 years later, she was arrested for prostitution and was diverted to that human trafficking intervention court. There, they identified her as previously been deemed a sex trafficking survivor by ICE. That is when she came to encounter Savvy and was referred, right? So she had this history, and then she came to Savvy. We also worked in conjunction with Sanctuaries for Families and making sure that she was granted her T visa application. This also included her daughters. So Savvy worked with her on family reunification psychotherapy processes, right? So she was separated from her family when she came to the United States and didn't have any contact with them. They had to be brought over. We made sure that she received trauma-educated psychotherapy services and support, emotional support, and other kinds of support during the T visa application. So that was kind of what we did for her. And eventually she was able to acquire paperwork and work legally and exit prostitution. So thank you all. That's my contact information up there. Yep, that's our program. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Savvy Supervisor Lindsay Curtis, Kings County ADA David Weiss, and Safe Horizon Senior Director Anita Tika. They will join us shortly for the Q&A. To summarize, we've learned about trafficking from a prosecution perspective and about services available for trafficked survivors. We've seen how government and service agencies work together to bring victims into survivor status. We now welcome back our panelists for Q&A. Committee Chair Victoria Pelotti has been reviewing your questions and will moderate this portion of the panel. Thank you so much. Go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you, Julie. To the audience, if you haven't already submitted your questions, please type them now into the Q&A at the base of your screen. But we will go forward with the questions we already have. For our first question, could each of you speak to your outreach efforts, including training and education? And we'll start with David.
Sure. So as part of our task force mandate, we are mandated by DOJ to give outreach and training regularly. I mean, that's also a big part of what the TVAPA speaks about. So we do presentations like this and panels where I'm now speaking with community members. We get requests from other law enforcement agencies, from churches, from various different groups around the community who are asking for presentations and wanting one-on-ones and sometimes more targeted trainings, which is for professionals, which is not just which is more for investigating and prosecuting. So that's kind of what we do. We do community events every year. I know me and Anita are speaking. We're talking about our January event. So we just do a lot of that kind of outreach to the community to make them aware, understand the signs, but more importantly, not just making them aware, but also from a practical level, understanding to help make sure their families and their kids and their loved ones stay safe and have the right tools to navigate today's society, which is tough.
Thank you, David. Anita?
Sure. So like Dave, we get a lot of requests for training. And so that's why we have a dedicated position for training and outreach. And so some of the demographics that we have trained in the past and currently include groups of social workers at medical facilities. And I'm glad that Lindsay mentioned that law when that law went into effect, that all medical providers in New York State have to be trained in human trafficking and have internal procedures and protocols in place for what to do after. We were getting a lot of requests to train medical providers. And so we decided to focus on what are the really big area hospitals that work with a lot of immigrants. And so we trained Jamaica Hospital, Flushing Hospital a few times. We've trained other NGOs. We've trained lawyers. We've trained students and educators. And a quick anecdote, after we had trained, a few months after we had trained, I think it was Jamaica Hospital, I got a call, my cell phone, middle of the night, and they had a patient who they thought might be a victim of trafficking. And this was because of the indicators that they had picked up on during the training and that they had embedded in their own EMR records. And so they have their list of indicators. The patient's presentation ticked off a number of those indicators. And so they called me and they asked me to speak to the patient. And so, it's one of these classic things where the patient was in the public hallway of the emergency room. Of course, the person is not going to disclose anything. And so I said, let's go to the bathroom. So take me into the bathroom with you. I'm on the phone. You're with the nurse. And from there, she was in a safe space and she was able to disclose, and we were able to connect her with social services when she was discharged. And so the trainings really do have a pretty significant impact.
Thank you, Anita. Lindsay?
Thank you. I'll expand a little bit on what I was discussing during my presentation in terms of reproductive health care. So we do a lot of outreach at OBGYN clinics, public clinics, to make sure that clinicians can recognize some of those signs, how to screen, how to ask that question. We're not always addressing trafficking as an immediate emergent cause of an issue or a presentation. Maybe somebody's history includes that, right? And we want someone to get care, even if it's 10 years later. So from Savvy's perspective, even if this was occurring way, way in the past, we are still there for that survivor, wherever they are in their journey. So someone who may have certain reproductive indicators, such as repeated exposure to STIs, repeated miscarriages or pregnancies. Someone may be unable to give birth or have pelvic inflammatory disease, bladder-related diseases, things along that nature, and other kinds of symptoms around reproductive health care. So when someone's screening, how do you have a conversation in a trauma-informed way? And then follow up and referral to make sure that person gets care after the fact, because it can be really traumatizing to disclose that and start to address some long-term health consequences of something that wasn't even in their control. So that's really traumatizing. So then making sure that they get follow-up care from a program like Savvy, where they can receive free counseling, no questions asked, really. We don't ask about immigration. We don't ask about insurance. So that's something that we do in terms of long-term care.
Thank you, Lindsay. We have a question, but before we answer the questions, I want to let the audience know that we are at 7:00, so we understand if you need to leave, but we are addressing the questions in the Q&A that you've typed. So the next question is, how often do traffickers get away with it because their survivors don't want to confront them? David?
Unfortunately, that is a big part of it. And I can't give a number and a percentage, but that is a lot what we see for various reasons. And like I said, the experts better than me spoke about the trauma and how it affects people and how their willingness or ability to continue the prosecution. And a lot is based on the current laws of how the trafficking laws are structured and our burden of bringing cases to a grand jury with the evidentiary issues that we require. Ultimately, a lot of times, if the victim is not in a place where they're comfortable testifying and moving forward, we cannot proceed. Well, we work really hard at doing evidence-based prosecutions, which ties into the trauma-informed, to try to make cases without relying on the victim, but that is a fact-specific case, and due to that fact, a lot of times we can't proceed without a victim if there isn't corroboration, if there isn't electronic evidence or other ways that we can prove the case or other victims that are willing to speak. So unfortunately, it does happen a lot, but we're always there. There's no timetable where we turn off the phone and say, you can't call us anymore. There might be statute of limitation issues, but we're always willing, working with a victim when they're ready. We've had cases where we had initial meetings, a couple interviews, and then they just weren't ready. They weren't comfortable. And 6-7 months later, we got a call back from them, their case manager, their social worker, and now they're ready to come forward. So we're always waiting. We're always willing, and we work where we reach where the victim is at. And ultimately, if for their best health and issues, it's better for them not to testify, and we may have to let a trafficker go unpunished. The health of a victim is always our priority and always our benefit. So not benefit, but always how we're moving forward. So that's what we look to first and foremost.
Thank you, David. So is there anything either Anita or Lindsay can add to that? Okay. So if we could just go back to the red flags. I think our audience wants to help. We are all community members. So what would be a key red flag that you would suggest, Anita?
Given that most of our clients are labor trafficked, there's usually a plethora. So the grouping is confiscation of your documents. So if your visa, your passport, any of your identifying information has been confiscated, that's a problem. If you are being made to live where you work, that's an issue. If you are not being paid anything or very little, so you're not being paid overtime, you're not being paid what you were told you would be paid, that's an issue. If you are in debt bondage, so if you had to pay pretty heightened recruitment fees, transportation fees, immigration visa related fees to come to the United States, you shouldn't have to pay for the right to work. So many of our clients come here and they're already in pretty significant debt bondage. Physical and psychological assault, sexual assault, regardless of the type of labor trafficking, working a pretty staggering number of hours and doing work that goes well beyond what you were told you would be doing and what you agreed to do. And so there's this constellation of pretty common indicators that we see, particularly with labor trafficking. They tend to be foreign nationals. There tend to be no knowledge of worker rights, and there tend to be language barriers and threats to report the person to ICE for deportation if they try to leave.
Thank you. Is there anything anyone else would like to add to the red flags? Okay. So we don't have any other questions. So
Victoria, there was a question from a Queens member, especially I guess for Savvy. Are you familiar with the alleged trafficking in the Jackson Heights area? There seems to be an abundance.
Sure. So we do work with trafficking courts out in Queens. So we're aware that there are certain areas that may experience higher rates of trafficking than other neighborhoods. And we do try to keep our eye on that and stay engaged for sure. Although we aren't looking at it from a criminal justice perspective so much. So we're a little less thinking about it geographically and more where avenues that people come to us from. We don't do a lot of street outreach. So we wouldn't go out and say, here's Savvy. We do a lot of other kinds of outreach, or we use survivors who feel they're ready to actually engage in their own communities, and they go back to their communities in Queens and the Bronx and other areas and sort of advocate out there to survivors is actually really incredible. So I can share that. It's incredible to see that some survivors who have done a lot of work will go back in their own communities and share the information and help trafficking victims and send them to Savvy.
Thank you to our panelists for the work you do. You have really opened our eyes to what trafficking is all about. We hope we have dispelled any myths about trafficking and that tonight's presentation has turned our thinking around. And so we have local resources, which would be the three organizations represented by our panelists. And then we have national resources, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is sponsored by the Polaris Project. The Department of Homeland Security has an amazing newsletter, and I highly recommend that you sign up for it. It's very, very informative. And of course, we have the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office on Trafficking.
Thank you again, panelists, for appearing for our webinar here today. Our next webinar is Tuesday, January 11th, 2022 at 6 p.m. Our focus will shift from New York City to trafficking nationally and globally. Its aim is to bring us to action. You will be receiving a follow-up email, and please take the time to complete the survey and return it to us. We welcome your comments and feedback. If you'd like to become a member, please visit our website at brooklynqueensnow.org. Until then, happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you all so much for attending.